The winter wind howled through the cracks of Martha Sullivan's cabin like a wounded animal, and the fire in her hearth was burning down to embers. She had just enough wood to last until morning, and barely enough beans and cornmeal to feed herself for another week. But when she heard the soft knock at her door that December night in 1873, something in her chest told her to answer it, despite every reasonable voice in her head screaming that a woman alone on the Kansas prairie should never open her door after dark. Two children stood on her porch, their faces hollow with hunger, their clothes nothing more than rags, stitched together with hope and desperation. The boy couldn't have been more than 10 years old, his sister perhaps 8. Their lips were blue from the cold, and their eyes held that terrible emptiness that Martha had seen too many times during the war, the look of souls who had forgotten what it meant to feel safe. "Please, ma'am," the boy whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind. "We ain't eaten in 3 days. We don't need much, just a place by your fire till morning." Martha Sullivan had lost everything once before. Her husband Thomas had gone off to fight for the Union and never came home. Her infant son had succumbed to fever the following winter. Her family back in Pennsylvania had disowned her for marrying an Irishman. This patch of stubborn prairie land and the small cabin Thomas had built before the war was all she had left in this world. She should have turned them away. She should have protected the little she had. Instead, she stepped aside and let them in. The children moved like ghosts into her cabin, their eyes widening at the sight of the fire. Martha could see them trying not to stare at the pot of beans hanging over the flames, trying not to appear too desperate, too hungry. It broke something in her to see children working so hard to maintain dignity when they should have been allowed to simply be children. She ladled out half of her remaining beans into 2 wooden bowls, added the last of her salt pork, and watched as they ate. At first, they tried to eat slowly, tried to be polite, but hunger won out, and soon they were devouring the food with a desperation that made Martha's heart ache. Elizabeth started crying as she ate, silent tears streaming down her dirty face, and James put his arm around her shoulders while he finished his own bowl. "There's more," Martha lied, even though there wasn't. "You eat your fill now." She gave them the blankets from her own bed, the good wool ones that Thomas had bought from a trader before the war, and told them to sleep by the fire. She would make do with her winter coat and Thomas's old Union jacket as she settled into her chair for what she knew would be a long, cold night. She watched the children burrow into the blankets like small animals finding shelter after a storm. "Miss Martha," James whispered into the darkness after a while. "Yes, child." "Why did you let us in? The other folks? They said they couldn't spare nothing. Said times was too hard. But you're alone, and you don't got much either. We can see that." Martha was quiet for a long moment, thinking about how to answer. Finally, she said, "My Thomas, he used to say that the measure of a person isn't what they do when they have plenty. It's what they do when they have nothing. I figure he was right about that." "Your Thomas, he sounds like he was a good man," James said. "The best I ever knew," Martha replied, her voice thick. "He would have let you in, too, probably would have given you his own supper, and pretended he wasn't hungry." She heard Elizabeth's small voice then, already half asleep. "We'll remember you, Miss Martha, forever and ever. You just remember to take care of each other," Martha said. "That's all that matters in this world, taking care of each other." "Oh, what are your names?" she asked as they settled in, their small bodies finally beginning to stop shaking. "I'm James," the boy said. "This here's my sister Elizabeth. Our folks died of cholera last month. We've been walking since, trying to reach our uncle in Abilene." "Abilene's 100 miles south," Martha said gently. "You're headed north." The boy's face crumpled, but he didn't cry. Elizabeth curled into a ball, and Martha saw her small shoulders shake silently. These children had already learned that tears were a luxury they couldn't afford. "You'll stay here tonight," Martha said firmly. "Tomorrow we'll figure out how to get you where you need to go." That night Martha lay awake in her chair, listening to the soft breathing of the children and wondering what she had done. She couldn't afford to feed 2 extra mouths. Winter was only beginning, and her supplies wouldn't last. But as she sat there in the darkness, wrapped in Thomas's old jacket that still faintly smelled of him even after all these years, she thought about the war and all the senseless loss it had brought. She thought about her baby boy, so small in her arms when fever took him, his little body burning hot and then growing cold. She thought about all the doors that had closed in her own face when she'd needed help. The world had been cruel to her, had taken everything she loved. But sitting there in the cold darkness, listening to two orphaned children finally sleeping peacefully, Martha realized something important. The world's cruelty didn't have to define her. She could choose to be different. She could choose to be the kind of person who opened doors instead of closing them, who shared instead of hoarding, who remembered what it meant to be human even when being human hurt. Something in those children's eyes had reminded her of a simple truth she'd almost forgotten. Sometimes the only thing that keeps us human is the choice to share what little we have. Morning came cold and clear. Martha made a thin porridge from her dwindling cornmeal and told the children they could stay for a few days, just until they regained their strength. Those days turned into a week. The week turned into 2. During those weeks, Martha learned their stories. She learned that their father had been a school teacher in Missouri, a gentleman who loved books and believed education could lift people out of poverty. Their mother had been a seamstress, her fingers quick and clever with a needle. They'd been traveling to Kansas to start fresh when cholera swept through their wagon train. Within a week, both parents were gone, buried in shallow graves along the trail. James and Elizabeth had been left with nothing but each other and the vague knowledge that their father's brother lived somewhere in Abilene. They'd walked for 3 weeks, begging at farmhouses and towns, sleeping in barns when they were lucky, and under the stars when they weren't. By the time they reached Martha's door, they were nearly finished. Papa used to read to us every night, Elizabeth told Martha one evening as they sat by the fire. Even on the trail, even when he was tired from walking all day, he said stories were food for the soul. Martha had few books, but she had Thomas's Bible and an old copy of Robinson Crusoe that had belonged to her father. She read to them in the evenings and watched their faces light up with something she hadn't seen before. Hope. Not just hope for survival, but hope that life could still hold beauty and wonder. James proved handy with repairs, fixing the loose boards in her cabin wall and patching the holes that let in the wind. He had his father's patience and precision, working carefully at each task until it was done right. Elizabeth had gentle hands with the chickens and managed to find eggs where Martha had thought there were none. She sang while she worked, old songs her mother had taught her, and the sound of her voice made the cabin feel less lonely. But Martha knew it couldn't last. Her supplies were nearly gone, and she had no money to buy more. She'd been rationing her own portions to make sure the children had enough, and she could feel her dresses hanging looser on her frame. The children needed to reach their uncle, and she needed to face the harsh truth of her own survival. She had done what she could, had given them time to heal and grow strong. Now she had to let them go. On the morning she planned to send them on their way, she woke to find them already dressed, their meager belongings bundled in cloth. "We know we need to go," James said, his young face trying so hard to look brave. "You've been kinder to us than anyone had a right to be, Miss Martha. We won't forget it." Martha packed them what little food she could spare, wrapped them in the warmest clothes she could find, and pointed them south toward Abilene. She gave James the last $4 she had in the world, money she'd been saving for spring seed. "Find your uncle," she told them, "and when you do, you tell him what good children you are. Tell him you survived because you're strong and you're smart and you look after each other." Elizabeth hugged her tightly, and Martha felt the girl's tears soaking through her dress. James shook her hand like a man, his grip firm despite his small hand. "We're going to repay you someday, Miss Martha," he said. "I promise." Martha watched them disappear into the winter landscape, two small figures growing smaller against the vast white prairie, and she felt the weight of loneliness settle back onto her shoulders like an old familiar coat. The years that followed were hard. Martha Sullivan learned to survive on almost nothing. She worked her small plot of land with determination that bordered on stubbornness, growing just enough to feed herself and sell a little at market. She took in mending from the women in town, earning pennies that she saved in a tin can beneath her floorboard. She aged in the way that frontier women do, her hands growing rough and her face weathering like the land itself. There were nights when she went to bed with her stomach empty, nights when the cold seeped through every crack in her cabin walls, nights when she wondered if she'd made a terrible mistake that winter. She could have kept all her food for herself. She could have made it through that winter with something to spare. But whenever those thoughts came, she would remember James and Elizabeth, their thin faces by her fire, and she knew she'd made the right choice. Some things were more important than survival. The town of Meadowbrook grew up around her property, spreading westward as the railroad came through. Businesses appeared, families settled, and the wild prairie began to give way to civilization. Martha watched it all from her small cabin, a relic of an earlier time. The new settlers looked at her with a mixture of pity and puzzlement. Why did she live like this, alone and struggling, when she could sell her land and move into town? Why did she cling to this patch of stubborn earth? But Martha knew why. This was Thomas's land, the home he'd built with his own hands before the war took him. She could still see him out in the yard, planning where to put the barn, talking about the family they'd raise here, the life they'd build. Selling would feel like losing him all over again, like admitting that all his dreams had died with him. So she stayed, and she endured, and she survived. Her small acts of kindness became known in Meadowbrook. She always had soup for a hungry traveler, always found a way to help a family in need, even when she had almost nothing herself. People began to say that Martha Sullivan was touched by something holy, that she had a grace about her that couldn't be explained. But Martha didn't feel holy. She just felt tired and alone and determined to keep honoring the memory of a man who had believed in goodness. Martha's cabin, once isolated and alone, now sat just at the edge of the growing town. Developers came calling, offering to buy her land, but Martha always refused. This was Thomas's land, the home he'd built with his own hands. She would die here before she'd sell it. But by 1885, 12 years after that winter night, Martha was 53 years old and feeling every day of it. Her back ached from years of hard work. Her fingers were stiff with arthritis, and the constant worry about money had worn grooves into her face. The town council had been pressuring her to sell, hinting that they had ways of making things difficult for those who stood in the way of progress. Then, one afternoon in late spring, a fine black carriage pulled up in front of her cabin. Martha was in her garden, trying to coax life from stubborn soil, when she heard the horses. She looked up, shading her eyes against the sun, and watched as two people stepped down from the carriage. They were well dressed, clearly people of means. The man wore a fine suit with a gold watch chain, and the woman was elegant in a traveling dress of deep blue. Martha's first thought was that they must be lost, that they'd taken a wrong turn and ended up in front of her humble cabin by mistake. She brushed the dirt from her hands and stood, ready to give them directions to wherever they actually needed to be. For a moment, Martha simply stared, wondering what business such people could have with her. Then she noticed something about the way they were looking at her, not with the usual pity or condescension she'd grown accustomed to from wealthy folk, but with something that looked like joy mixed with nervousness. Then the man smiled, and something in that smile tickled at her memory. It was familiar in a way she couldn't quite place, like a song she'd heard long ago but couldn't remember the words to. "Miss Martha?" he said, and his voice carried across the years. "Do you remember us?" Martha's breath caught in her throat. The boy, James, the girl, Elizabeth, but they weren't children anymore. They were grown, successful, and standing in front of her with expressions that held both joy and something else, something that looked like triumph. "James?" she whispered. "Elizabeth? Lord above, I thought I'd never see you again." Elizabeth rushed forward and embraced her, and Martha felt tears spring to her eyes. James followed, his handshake warm and firm, and Martha could see the boy she'd once known still there in the man's face, just older, wiser, and clearly much more prosperous than she'd ever dared to hope. "We made it to Abilene," James said, his voice thick with emotion. "Our uncle took us in, raised us proper. He was a cattleman, did well for himself, and he treated us like his own children. He passed away last year," Elizabeth added softly. "Left everything to us, his ranch, his savings, his investments. James and we've done well, Miss Martha, better than we ever dreamed." Martha felt happiness flooding through her, genuine and pure. "I'm so glad," she said. "I've thought of you both so many times over the years, wondered if you made it, if you were safe." "We never forgot you," James said. "Never forgot what you did for us that winter. You gave us everything when you had nothing. You saved our lives." "I just gave you a warm place to sleep and a bit of food," Martha said, suddenly embarrassed. "Any decent person would have done the same." "But they didn't," Elizabeth said firmly. "We knocked on 7 doors before yours that night. 7 families turned us away, even though they had full larders and warm houses. You were the only one who let us in, even though you couldn't afford to." James reached into his coat and pulled out a leather portfolio. "We came back to keep a promise, Miss Martha. We came back to repay you." He opened the portfolio and handed her a stack of official-looking documents. Martha stared at them, her hands trembling slightly as she tried to make sense of the legal language. "What is this?" she asked. "Land deeds," James said. 320 acres just west of here. Prime land, good soil, access to water. It's in your name now. And this," he pulled out another document, "is a bank note for $5,000, enough to build a proper house, hire help if you want it, live comfortably for the rest of your days." Martha felt the world tilt beneath her feet. She looked at the papers, then at the two young people standing before her, and she couldn't quite believe what was happening. "I can't accept this," she whispered. "It's too much. I just gave you some beans and a place to sleep." "You gave us hope when we had none," Elizabeth said, taking Martha's rough, work-worn hands in her own smooth ones. "You gave us kindness when the world had shown us only cruelty. You chose to share what little you had, even though it meant you'd have less. That's not nothing, Miss Martha. That's everything." Martha felt tears streaming down her face now, and she made no effort to stop them. She thought of all the years of struggle, all the nights she'd gone to bed hungry, all the winters she'd shivered in her thin cabin. She thought of Thomas and the life they'd planned that never came to be. She thought of her baby boy, buried on the hill behind her cabin, and she thought of those two small, desperate children who had knocked on her door 12 years ago. "I don't know what to say," she managed. "Say you'll accept it," James said gently. "Please, Miss Martha, let us do this for you. Let us give back what you gave us, the chance at a better life." But before Martha could respond, she heard the sound of horses approaching. A group of men rode up, led by Cornelius Blackwood, the president of the town council and one of the wealthiest landowners in the county. He was a hard man with cold eyes, and Martha's heart sank at the sight of him. "Martha Sullivan," Blackwood called out, dismounting from his horse with the confidence of a man who was used to getting his way. "I see you have visitors. Fine carriage. Are these the friends you've been expecting to buy you out? Because I'm afraid you're too late." Martha felt ice settle in her stomach. "What do you mean?" Blackwood pulled a document from his coat with a satisfied smile. "I mean that I've finally found a way to claim this land. You see, there's been some question about the original deed to this property. Your late husband never properly filed certain paperwork with the county. A simple oversight, I'm sure, but it means the land technically reverted to the county 3 years ago, and yesterday I purchased it from them at auction. This land is mine now, Mrs. Sullivan. You have 30 days to vacate." Martha felt the world crumbling around her. It couldn't be true. Thomas had been so careful, so thorough. But she'd never looked at the papers after he died, never thought to verify or update them. She'd been too lost in grief, too focused on simple survival. "You can't do this," she said, but her voice was weak. "This is my home. I can and I have," Blackwood said. "The law is quite clear. Now I'm not an unreasonable man. I'll give you $50 for the cabin, since you'll need to move it off my land. That's generous, considering the structure isn't worth half that." Eek! James stepped forward, his face hardening into an expression Martha recognized, the same determined look he'd had as a boy. "Mr. Blackwood, is it? I'm afraid you've miscalculated." Blackwood looked at James with disdain. "And who might you be, boy?" "James Whitmore," James said evenly. "And this is my sister, Elizabeth Whitmore Hayes. Perhaps you've heard of Whitmore Cattle and Land Company. We have operations throughout Kansas, Colorado, and Wyoming." Martha saw Blackwood's expression flicker with something that might have been recognition, and perhaps the first hint of concern. "We've just been discussing a land transaction with Miss Sullivan," James continued, "and it seems fortuitous that you're here. You see, I'm very interested in this matter of unclear deeds and county auctions. Tell me, was this auction properly advertised? Were all interested parties notified?" "That's none of your concern," Blackwood said, but his voice had lost some of its confidence. "Oh, but it is," Elizabeth said, stepping forward with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You see, my husband is a lawyer, quite a good one, and he's made a specialty of cases involving fraudulent land seizures. It's remarkable how often these county auctions turn out to be nothing more than backroom deals between corrupt officials and wealthy men looking to steal land from widows and working folk." Blackwood's face reddened. "Now, see here?" "No, you see here," James said, his voice cold as winter iron. "I'm going to make you an offer, Mr. Blackwood. You're going to tear up that deed you just showed us. You're going to return to the county office and explain that there was an error, that the Sullivan property was never actually eligible for auction. And in exchange for your cooperation, we won't launch an investigation into your business practices. You can't threaten me." Blackwood sputtered. "It's not a threat," Elizabeth said calmly. "It's a promise. We have resources you can't imagine, Mr. Blackwood. We have lawyers, investigators, and connections all the way to the territorial governor. If you choose to fight us on this, we will bury you in legal proceedings. We will examine every land deal you've ever made. We will audit every property you claim to own. And something tells me we'll find more than a few irregularities." Martha watched in amazement as Blackwood's bluster deflated like a punctured bladder. He looked from James to Elizabeth, clearly calculating his options and not liking any of them. "Furthermore," James added, pulling another document from his portfolio, "I have here a corrected deed for this property, properly filed and notarized as of this morning. You'll find everything is in order. Mrs. Sullivan's ownership is beyond dispute." "How did you—" Blackwood started, then stopped. You knew about this before you came here." "We did our research," James said. "We've been planning this visit for months, Mr. Blackwood. We wanted to make sure Miss Martha would be protected. We knew men like you existed, men who prey on the vulnerable. We just didn't expect you to make it so easy for us." Blackwood's jaw clenched, and for a moment Martha thought he might try to fight. But then something in his eyes changed. A calculation made and accepted. He was beaten, and he knew it. "Fine," he spat. "Keep your worthless patch of dirt. It's not worth the trouble." He mounted his horse and rode off, his men following, leaving a cloud of dust and defeated pride in their wake. Martha stood there, trembling, unable to quite process what had just happened. James turned to her with a gentle smile. "I'm sorry you had to see that, Miss Martha, but we've been keeping an eye on your situation for the past year, making sure everything was in order. When we heard about Blackwood's plans, we moved quickly to protect you." "You've been watching over me?" Martha said, her voice breaking. "All this time?" "Always," Elizabeth said softly. "You were never alone, Miss Martha. We never forgot. We never stopped caring about the woman who saved us when we needed her most." Martha looked at the deeds in her hand, at the banknote, at these two remarkable people who had once been desperate children shivering by her fire. She thought about Thomas and how he would have loved this moment, how he would have been so proud that his wife's simple act of kindness had created such a beautiful circle of grace. "I don't deserve this," she whispered. "Yes, you do," James said firmly. "You deserve this and so much more. You're the reason we're standing here today. You're the reason we survived to become the people we are. Everything we've accomplished, every success we've had, it all started with your kindness on that winter night." Elizabeth took Martha's hand again. "We want you to have more than just land and money, Miss Martha. We want you to have family again. We want you to come to our homes for holidays, to know our children when we have them, to be the grandmother they deserve. We want you to be part of our lives, the way you should have been all along." Martha felt something break open inside her chest, some wall she'd built around her heart to survive the lonely years. She pulled both James and Elizabeth into an embrace, this woman who had lost everything and found it again in the most unexpected way. "I would like that," she said through her tears. "I would like that very much." The news of what happened spread through Meadowbrook like wildfire. The story of the widow Sullivan, who had helped two orphan children and been rewarded beyond measure, captured everyone's imagination. People who had once looked at Martha with pity or indifference now regarded her with respect and even awe. James and Elizabeth stayed in Meadowbrook for 2 weeks, helping Martha make plans for her new land. They hired builders to construct a proper house, nothing ostentatious but comfortable and warm, with a bedroom for each of them when they came to visit. They stocked her pantry and hired a local woman to help with the housework and cooking. They introduced her to their lawyer, who would manage her affairs and ensure no one ever tried to cheat her again. But more than the material changes, they gave Martha something she hadn't had in years: hope for the future. They talked late into the evenings about their uncle, about the ranch in Abilene, about their plans for the future. James had expanded the cattle business and was now investing in the growing railroad industry. Elizabeth had married well, to a good man who treated her like an equal partner, and they were building a life in Denver. Uncle Samuel used to tell us that luck is what happens when kindness meets opportunity, James said one evening as they sat on Martha's porch, watching the sun set over the prairie. He said that the world rewards those who look beyond themselves, who choose to help even when it's hard. He lived that way, and he taught us to do the same. He would have liked you, Miss Martha, Elizabeth added. He would have understood exactly why you opened your door to us that night. I'm just glad you found him, Martha said. I'm glad you had someone to love you and raise you right. We had 2 people, James corrected gently. We had Uncle Samuel, and we had you. You were the first person to show us that the world still had good people in it. You gave us faith that kindness existed. That's what kept us going during those 100 miles to Abilene. The memory of your fire, your food, your gentle voice telling us we could stay. That's what we held on to when the journey got hard. On their last night in Meadowbrook, Elizabeth presented Martha with one more gift, a photograph of James, Elizabeth, and their Uncle Samuel, taken a few years before his passing. "I want you to have this," Elizabeth said, "so you can remember that you're part of our family, that you always have been." Martha placed the photograph on her mantel, right next to the tintype of Thomas in his Union uniform. Two families, both born from loss and kindness, both proof that love finds a way to survive. The morning they left, Martha stood in front of her new house, watching their carriage roll away toward the train station. But this time, the loneliness didn't return. This time, she knew they'd be back. They'd promised to visit for Christmas, and Martha had no doubt they'd keep their word. They'd spent 12 years finding their way back to her. They wouldn't disappear now. Martha Sullivan lived in her comfortable house for another 23 years. She became a beloved figure in Meadowbrook, known for her generosity and her habit of always having a warm meal for anyone who needed it. She never turned away a hungry traveler or a family down on their luck. Her door was always open, her fire always burning. Word spread about Martha's kindness, and people began coming to her, not just for food or shelter, but for advice, for comfort, for the kind of wisdom that comes from having survived great loss and chosen grace over bitterness. Young mothers sought her counsel, troubled souls found peace in her presence, and the lost discovered that her door was a place where judgment ended and understanding began. She became known as Grandma Martha, not just to James and Elizabeth's children, but to half the young people in Meadowbrook. She taught them to read using Thomas's old books, showed them how to coax vegetables from reluctant soil, and told them stories about the old days when the prairie was wild and survival meant depending on each other. But more than anything, she taught them by example that kindness wasn't weakness, that generosity wasn't foolishness, and that the best investment a person could make was in another human being's welfare. James and Elizabeth visited regularly, bringing their spouses and eventually their children. Martha became Grandma Martha to a growing brood of grandchildren who loved to hear her stories about the old days, about their parents as scared, hungry children, about the winter night that changed all their lives. James's oldest son, named Thomas after Martha's late husband, once asked her why she'd let his father and aunt in that night when so many others had turned them away. "Because, child," Martha said, pulling the boy close, "your father and aunt taught me something that night, though they were too young to know it. They taught me that we're never so poor that we can't give something, we're never so weak that we can't help someone weaker, and we're never so lost that we can't be someone else's light in the darkness. That's what keeps us human, Thomas. Not our strength, not our wealth, but our choice to share what little light we have." The land James and Elizabeth had given her prospered. Martha leased most of it to local farmers, taking a modest rent that kept her comfortable without making her wealthy. She didn't need wealth. She had something better, a life filled with purpose, connection, and the knowledge that a simple act of kindness had rippled out into the world in ways she could never have imagined. On cold winter nights, Martha would sometimes stand by her window and look out at the prairie, remembering that distant evening when two small faces had appeared at her door. She thought about how close she'd come to turning them away, how her life would have been different if she'd chosen fear over compassion, self-preservation over mercy. She thought about all the people who had turned those children away before they reached her door, and she wondered if they ever knew what they'd missed. Not the material rewards, though those had been extraordinary, but the simple joy of knowing that you'd made a difference, that you'd chosen to be a light in someone's darkness. The last document James gave Martha, which she kept in a locked box under her bed, was a contract establishing a trust. Upon her passing, the land would be used to build a home for orphaned children, a place where no child would ever be turned away, where every lost soul could find warmth and safety. The deed required that above the door of this home there would be a simple inscription. "Here, all who are hungry and cold will find welcome, in memory of Martha Sullivan, who opened her door when others closed theirs." Martha never told anyone about this document. It was her secret, her way of ensuring that the circle of kindness would continue long after she was gone. She'd learned that the greatest legacy wasn't land or money, but the decision to choose compassion even when it cost you everything. Years later, when Martha Sullivan passed away peacefully in her sleep at the age of 76, the entire town of Meadowbrook turned out for her funeral. James and Elizabeth were there, of course, along with their families, but there were others too. People Martha had helped over the years, travelers she'd fed, families she'd supported through hard times. They came to pay respects to a woman who had made the world a little bit kinder simply by opening her door. The Sullivan Home for Children opened 2 years later, a beautiful building with warm rooms and a kitchen that always smelled of fresh bread. Above the door, as promised, was Martha's inscription, and inside, by the main fireplace, hung a portrait of Martha Sullivan, painted from a photograph taken in her later years. In the painting, she was smiling, her eyes warm and welcoming, her hand extended as if inviting someone in from the cold. The home was everything James and Elizabeth had envisioned, a place where no child would ever feel the desperate fear they'd known that winter night. It had a library filled with books donated by families throughout the county who'd heard Martha's story. It had a large kitchen where children could learn to cook, to create nourishment and comfort with their own hand. It had bedrooms with real beds and warm quilts, workshops where children could learn trades, and a schoolroom where education was treated as the treasure it was. But more than the building itself, the home embodied Martha's spirit. The staff were carefully chosen not just for their skills, but for their capacity for compassion. They were people who understood that broken children needed more than food and shelter. They needed someone to believe in them, to see past their hunger and fear to the potential that lay beneath. Every child who came through those doors learned Martha's story. They learned about the winter night when she chose to share what little she had with 2 desperate children. They learned about James and Elizabeth, who never forgot a kindness shown in their darkest hour. And they learned the most important lesson of all, that the smallest act of compassion offered at the right moment can change not just one life, but ripple out through generations, creating waves of goodness that touch shores you'll never see. Over the years, hundreds of children passed through the Sullivan home. They grew up, found their places in the world, and carried with them the lesson Martha had taught, that kindness multiplies, that generosity returns, and that the measure of a life isn't what you accumulate, but what you give away when giving costs you dearly. In Meadowbrook, they still tell the story of Martha Sullivan, the widow who gave away her last beans and her only blankets to 2 starving children. They tell how those children returned with land deeds and fortunes, how they protected her from those who would have stolen her home, how they loved her like a mother for the rest of her days. Visitors to the town often stop at the Sullivan home, wanting to see where Martha's legacy lives on. They walk through the halls, see the children laughing and learning, and understand something profound about the nature of generosity. They see that Martha's gift wasn't really about beans or blankets or even land deeds. It was about the radical choice to see another person's humanity when it would have been easier to look away. The portrait of Martha in the main hall has become almost sacred to the community. Children who graduate from the home often return years later with their own children standing before that painting and telling the story of the woman who opened her door. Many of them go on to open their own doors, to extend their own hands to those in need, continuing the circle of kindness that Martha began on that cold winter night so many years ago. But the people who truly understand the story know that it's not really about the reward at all. It's about the moment Martha opened her door. It's about the choice she made when every practical voice in her head told her to turn those children away. It's about the profound truth that we are most human when we give what we cannot afford to give, when we share what we cannot spare, when we choose love over fear, even when the cost is dear. Historians who study the settlement of Kansas sometimes mention the Sullivan home in their books, noting it as an example of frontier philanthropy, but they miss the deeper truth. The Sullivan home wasn't built on wealth or planning or careful investment. It was built on a widow's choice to split her last meal with strangers, on 2 children who never forgot, and on the understanding that the greatest fortunes are made not in banks, but in hearts. That's the real reward Martha Sullivan earned that winter night. Not land or money or security, though those came too. The real reward was knowing with absolute certainty that she had lived a life that mattered, that her time on this earth had made it a better place, that when the cold wind had brought desperate children to her door, she had chosen to let them in. In her final years, Martha would sometimes sit in her comfortable house, surrounded by photographs of the family she had gained, and marvel at the strange mathematics of generosity. She'd given away 2 bowls of beans and gained a dynasty. She'd shared her fire and ignited a warmth that would burn for generations. She'd opened her door to strangers and found her purpose, but she never saw it as a transaction, never calculated the return on her investment of kindness. To Martha, those 2 bowls of beans were simply what you did when children showed up hungry at your door. The fact that those children remembered, that they returned, that they built something beautiful from the foundation of her simple kindness. That wasn't something she'd earned or expected. It was grace, pure and simple. The universe's way of saying that sometimes, just sometimes, goodness is rewarded not because it deserves to be, but because the world needs evidence that kindness matters. And in the end, isn't that what we all hope for? To know that when the moment came, when we were tested and it would have been easier to look away, we chose instead to open our doors, to share our fire, to offer what comfort we could to those who needed it most. Martha Sullivan did that, and 2 children never forgot. And their gratitude became a legacy that warmed countless lives, just as Martha's fire had warmed them on that long-ago winter night when kindness was all she had left to give, and she gave it anyway. The story reminds us that we never know which moment will define us, which small act of mercy will echo through time. Martha couldn't have known, shivering in her chair that winter night, that she was planting seeds that would grow into forests. She couldn't have imagined that her 2 bowls of beans would nourish not just 2 hungry children, but hundreds of orphans yet to be born. She simply did what her heart told her was right, and trusted that somehow, in some way, it would matter. And it did matter. It mattered more than land or money or any treasure that could be counted. It mattered because it proved that one person, alone and poor and struggling, could still change the world. Not through grand gestures or great wealth, but through the simple, radical act of choosing compassion when fear would have been easier, choosing generosity when hoarding would have been wiser, choosing to open her door when closing it would have been safer. That's Martha Sullivan's true legacy, still alive in Meadowbrook, still burning like the fire that warmed 2 desperate children on the coldest night of their lives, still reminding us all that we have more to give than we think, that kindness costs less than we fear, and that the doors we open might just save more than the strangers standing on our porch. They might save us, too.